Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about kings or wars or the grand paintings that hang in museums centuries later. Tonight, we are going to slip quietly through a side door, the servant's door, low and unpainted, at the back of a great Tudor house, and follow the life of the person nobody wrote songs about. A whole invisible world lived behind those walls. Hands that lit every fire, carried every basin of water, scrubbed every floor, so that history could happen upstairs in the light. Think of it as an underground river running beneath a beautiful garden. You never see it, but nothing above the surface survives without it. If you're here tonight, you've probably had a long day of your own. Maybe your mind is still turning over a conversation, a task left unfinished, a small worry that keeps circling back like a moth around a lamp. That's all right. You don't need cosmic mysteries or difficult thoughts tonight. You just need somewhere gentle to rest your attention while your body remembers how to let go. That's exactly what we're here for. So we're going to wander gently through this world together, not rushing, not quizzing, not building towards some big reveal. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to figure out. Just my voice, low and slow, and a strange, dim, candlelit house from 500 years ago, waiting for us to step inside. Before we begin, if these gentle journeys ever help you drift off, a quiet like or subscribe helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. No pressure at all, just a small kindness if it feels right. Now, let's get comfortable. Let your body soften into whatever is holding you right now, the mattress, the couch, the pillow. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore tonight. Let your shoulders drop just slightly away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen, your tongue rest heavy in your mouth, your eyelids grow calm and unbothered. Let your breathing slow down all on its own. You don't need to control it. You don't need to do anything, actually. Not tonight. There's nothing to remember here, nothing to follow closely, no test waiting at the end of this. If your mind wanders off completely and never comes back, that's not failure, that's the whole point. Your only job right now is to exist quietly in the dark, while a story drifts past you like weather. So let your mind drift as we begin. Some servants woke while the moon was still out. In a Tudor household, the day did not begin with the master's eyes opening. It began long before, in the cold and the dark, when a scullery maid or a kitchen boy rose from a thin straw mattress to make sure the world was warm and lit, and ready before anyone important noticed it hadn't been. There were no alarm clocks. There was only habit, worry, and perhaps a rooster somewhere outside, indifferent to anyone's exhaustion. A servant might rise at 4 a.m. in summer, earlier in winter, when there was more to prepare before light came at all. Picture it slowly. A small room, or sometimes no room at all, just a corner near the kitchen, or a shared attic under the roof beams. The air is cold enough to see your breath. Whoever wakes first has to be the one who makes the whole house believe morning arrived gently, when really, morning arrived through someone else's aching shoulders and stiff, unwilling hands. You have never had to do this. Whatever tiredness follows you tonight, it is nothing like waking in true darkness to warm a house for people who will never know your name. There's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? That even now, some quiet part of you is allowed to simply rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Washing, in a Tudor servant's world, rarely meant warmth. There was no hot tap, no basin already filled and waiting. If a servant wanted to wash their face or hands, they usually broke the morning ice on a bucket left outside overnight, or dipped their fingers into water so cold it stung more than it cleaned. Soap, if it existed in the household at all, was often reserved for laundering the master's linens, not for a servant's own skin. Many servants simply rinsed with water and rubbed a rough cloth over their face, calling that clean enough to begin the day. There is something almost tender in imagining it, the shock of cold water on tired skin, done quickly, without complaint, because complaining changed nothing. The body adapts to almost anything if it must. A servant's hands, over years, grew rough and weathered from cold water and coarse cloth, hands that had long stopped noticing the sting. Tonight, whatever water touches your skin will likely be warm if you choose it to be. That small comfort, heat, on command, would have seemed like a kind of magic to someone standing shivering by a bucket 400 years ago. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Most servants did not sleep in a bed the way we imagine one. Instead, many slept on a straw-filled sack called a pallet, or tick, laid directly on a hard floor, sometimes near the kitchen fire for whatever warmth still lingered from the evening's cooking. Others slept in tiny box rooms, barely large enough to lie down flat, tucked beneath staircases, or under sloped attic roofs where you could only stand up straight in the very center of the room. Lower servants sometimes shared these thin mattresses 2 or 3 to a bed, simply for the shared warmth of another body in the cold months. There was little privacy and less comfort. The straw inside a pallet flattened over months of use, packed down until it offered barely more softness than the floorboards beneath it. And still, after a full day's labor, sleep came easily, because true physical exhaustion has a way of overpowering any discomfort. The body, worn thin enough, will rest almost anywhere. You tonight likely have more cushioning beneath you than most Tudor servants ever knew in their whole lives. Let that small fact settle over you like a blanket. You are already, in this very moment, more comfortable than centuries of tired bodies before you. But that is only one thread of this larger tapestry. A fire had to be born again every single morning. There was no simple switch, no small blue flame appearing at the turn of a knob. Overnight, the household fire was often banked, smothered gently under ash so a few embers survived till dawn. And it was a servant's job to coax that fire back to life before anyone else stirred. This meant kneeling on a cold hearth in the dark, blowing steadily on tiny orange embers, feeding them slivers of kindling, watching anxiously to see if the flame would catch or die. If the fire failed entirely, a servant might need to walk to a neighbor's house for a burning ember, carried carefully home in a covered pot, because striking a brand new flame from flint and steel was slow and unreliable, especially with cold, stiff fingers in the dark. An entire household's warmth for the day rested, quite literally, on someone else's steady breath and patience before the sun had even risen. Imagine that responsibility. An entire family's comfort depending on your careful hands in the dark, and no one upstairs ever wondering how difficult that quiet task truly was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Before flushing water and porcelain, there was the chamber pot, and someone had to empty it. In a great house, chamber pots sat beneath beds or tucked into small closets, used through the night by the family and honored guests. Come morning, it fell to the lowest servants to carry these pots away, empty them into a cesspit or a nearby ditch, rinse them, and return them silently to their places before anyone woke to notice the smell had gone. It was unglamorous, necessary work, done without thanks, done without being seen. Wealthier homes sometimes had a close stool, a padded seat with a hidden pot inside, disguised almost like furniture. But someone still had to service it, still had to carry away what polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist. The servant's job, in many ways, was to make the unpleasant realities of daily life invisible to everyone above them. There's something oddly grounding in remembering this. Every comfort we take for granted, quiet plumbing, simple privacy, was once someone else's daily, unspoken labor. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every servant wore the same clothes, and that told you everything about where you stood. Households often provided livery, a uniform of sorts, in the family's chosen colors, given once or twice a year as partial payment for service. A groom might wear one color, a kitchen boy another. A lady's personal maid, something finer still. This clothing marked rank instantly, the way a uniform does today, so that a stranger glancing across a hall could tell, at a single look, who held more trust and who held less. For many servants, this livery was among their only new clothing all year. Everything else might be handed down, patched, restitched from older garments, worn thin at the knees and elbows from years of kneeling and reaching. Clothes were valuable enough that a servant's small wardrobe was sometimes worth more in resale than several months of their wages combined. You, tonight, are wrapped in whatever you choose, without anyone reading your rank from the color of it. That quiet freedom is easy to forget how new it really is. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Servants ate what was left in the order that mattered least. In a great Tudor household, meals followed rank as strictly as clothing did. The master and his family ate first in the finest room from the finest food. Then came the higher servants, stewards, ladies' maids, valets, who might eat in a smaller hall, still with decent bread and meat. Lower servants, the scullions and kitchen boys, often ate last, from whatever remained, sometimes standing, sometimes crouched near the kitchen fire, because there was no formal place set for them at all. Their food was frequently pottage, a thick, simple stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat could be spared, eaten with coarse dark bread that had none of the fine white softness reserved for the family upstairs. It was filling, if plain, meal after meal, day after day, with little variation through the seasons, except whatever the garden or the larder happened to offer. Tonight, whatever comfort surrounds you, know that you are not waiting for anyone else's leftovers. You get to simply exist, fed and finished, without earning the privilege through hours of unseen labor first. But that is only one small part of the story. Water, in many households, was considered less trustworthy than beer. This sounds strange to modern ears, but wells and rivers near Tudor towns were often contaminated by waste, and nobody yet understood why illness followed dirty water so closely. So instead, households, including the servants within them, drank small beer through the day, a weak, low-alcohol brew, safer simply because the brewing process killed off many of the microbes that made water risky. Even children drank it, diluted and mild, more like today's flavored water than anything intoxicating. Brewing this daily beer was itself a servant's task, often a woman's responsibility, requiring grain, careful timing, and a working knowledge passed down through years of practice rather than written instruction. A household without reliable small beer was, in its own quiet way, a household at greater risk of sickness. It's a strange comfort to realize that behind something as simple as a drink of water, there was once so much invisible skill and danger, carefully managed by hands most people never thought to thank. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Turning a roasting spit for hours was, quite literally, someone's whole job. Before mechanical clockwork spits became common in wealthier kitchens, someone, often a young kitchen boy, sat close to an open fire for hours, slowly turning a metal rod skewered through meat, keeping it rotating evenly so it cooked without burning on one side. The heat from the open flame was intense, the work monotonous, and the boy's face and arms, often reddened from hours spent close to the fire's glow. This job, called being a turnspit, was sometimes given to the smallest, youngest servants precisely because it required patience rather than strength. Hours could pass this way, watching fat drip and sizzle, listening to the fire crackle, doing nothing else but turning, while the rest of the kitchen moved busily around them. There's something almost meditative in imagining it now. From a safe distance, hours of repetitive motion, firelight flickering, no need to think of anything else. Perhaps, strangely, it is not so different from what we're doing together right now. But that is only one small part of the story. Burns and small injuries were simply part of kitchen life. Open hearths, boiling pots, hot fat, and sharp knives filled a Tudor kitchen, and there was no modern safety equipment to soften any of it. Servants worked close to flames in loose clothing, reached into hot ovens with bare or thinly wrapped hands, and carried heavy iron pots without the benefit of insulated handles. Small burns were so common they barely warranted comment. A servant might simply run the injury under cold water, if water was near, and keep working. More serious accidents happened too, though rarely recorded, because the people who suffered them left few written records of their own lives. We know these dangers mostly through household accounts noting replaced servants, or occasional court records where a servant sued for injury and won a small settlement. One of the only glimpses history left us of an otherwise invisible person's pain. It's worth noticing gently how much unseen risk built the comfortable world so many people enjoyed without ever once looking toward the kitchen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Laundry day was one of the hardest, longest days of the household's month. Washing clothes and linens in Tudor times had no washing machine, no detergent poured neatly from a bottle. Instead, servants used a mixture of water, ash, and sometimes stale urine collected deliberately, because its ammonia content helped lift grease and stains from fabric. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed by hand against rough boards, pounded with wooden bats to loosen dirt, then rinsed repeatedly in cold water and hung to dry, weather permitting. This work took an entire day, sometimes several days for a large household's linens, and it was almost always physically brutal. Hands raw and cracked from lye and cold water, backs aching from bending over wash tubs for hours without rest. Laundry maids were often among the lowest paid servants. Despite work that left visible damage on their bodies for years. Whatever fabric rests against your skin tonight, however it came clean, remember it once required someone's whole aching day, and be grateful that comfort now asks so little of you. But that is only one small part of the story. Carrying water was a daily journey, not a simple task. Most households had no indoor plumbing, so water for cooking, cleaning, brewing, and washing had to be carried from a well, a spring, or a river. Sometimes a considerable distance from the house itself. A servant might make this trip many times a day, hauling heavy wooden buckets on a yoke across their shoulders, spilling and refilling, their arms and back growing, accustomed to a weight most of us would find exhausting after just one trip. In winter, this meant breaking ice at the water's surface before filling the bucket. In summer, it meant flies, heat, and the slow, patient walk back with water sloshing at every uneven step. This single task, water, touched nearly everything else in the household's daily rhythm, and someone had to fetch it over and over without complaint, because the house could not function without it. Tonight, water arrives for you with barely a thought, a turn of a handle. Let that ease be something you notice, just for a moment, before it fades quietly into the background again. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Light itself, after dark, was a luxury carefully rationed. Beeswax candles were expensive, reserved mostly for the wealthy family's rooms. Servants, if they had light at all after sunset, more often relied on rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal fat, burning dim and smoky for a short while before needing replacement. Some servants had no evening light at all, finishing their work by the last glow of the kitchen fire, then feeling their way to bed in near total darkness. Making rushlights was itself a task, often done by servants in quieter moments, peeling reeds down to their soft inner pith, then dipping them repeatedly in melted fat until they held enough to burn. The result was a weak, flickering, short-lived flame, nothing like the steady brightness we switch on without thought today. There's something quietly moving in imagining a whole life measured by such small, careful flickers of light, and how much darkness people once simply accepted as the shape of every night. But that is only one small part of the story. The workday, for most servants, stretched from before dawn until well after dark. There was no fixed 8-hour shift, no clock to punch, no clear boundary between on duty and off. A servant's day began with fires and water before sunrise, and often didn't end until the family had been put properly to bed at night, candles snuffed, doors checked, the household settled. In between stretched an unbroken chain of small physical tasks: cleaning, cooking, carrying, mending, serving, fetching, again and again, with only brief pauses for their own meals. Seasonal shifts made this harder still. Summer brought longer daylight and more outdoor work, gardens, harvests, animals. Winter brought fewer daylight hours, but colder, heavier labor, hauling firewood, breaking ice, keeping every room from freezing. Rest, in any real sense, was rare, and often came only when the body simply could not continue any further. Whatever tiredness carried you here tonight, let yourself notice how much smaller it is than the tiredness carried nightly by people who never once questioned that this was simply what a life looked like. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Servants, in most households, had shockingly few days entirely their own. Sundays sometimes offered a lighter workload, mostly to allow attendance at church, though even then meals still needed cooking and animals still needed tending. Beyond that, certain religious holidays throughout the year, a handful scattered across months, might bring a small reprieve from the heaviest labor, a few stolen hours to rest, visit family, or simply do nothing at all. But true days off, in the way we understand them now, a full day belonging entirely to yourself, with no expectation of labor, were rare luxuries, not standard rights. Many servants lived where they worked, meaning even their free hours happened inside the same walls that demanded their labor every other hour, making rest feel less like an escape and more like a brief pause before returning to the same unbroken rhythm. Tonight, this entire hour belongs to you completely, asking nothing of your hands or your body. That kind of ownership over your own time was, for centuries, almost unthinkable for people just like you. But that is only one small part of the story. Mistakes in a Tudor household were often met with the master's hand rather than a gentle word. Physical punishment for servants, especially young ones, was widely accepted, even expected, as a normal part of correcting behavior. A dropped plate, a burnt dish, a slow response to a call might result in a slap, a switch across the hand, or worse, depending on the household's temperament and the servant's age. This wasn't universal cruelty in every home, but it was common enough that no servant could assume kindness simply because a task was small. Children in service were especially vulnerable to this treatment, having little power to object and few places to turn if a household proved harsh. Some contracts of service even outlined reasonable correction as an accepted part of an employer's authority, blurring the line between discipline and simple mistreatment in ways that would be unthinkable to describe so plainly today. It's worth sitting with gently how much has changed in what we now consider an acceptable way to treat another tired, trying person. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Many servants began this life shockingly young, sometimes as children barely old enough to reach a countertop. It wasn't unusual for a child of 7, 8, or 9 to enter service, especially from poorer families who could not otherwise feed every mouth at home. These children often started with the smallest, humblest tasks: fetching, carrying, watching younger children of the household, running errands through muddy streets, slowly working upward as they aged and proved reliable. For many of these children, service was also an education of sorts, teaching household skills, basic manners, sometimes even reading if a kind household allowed it, preparing them for a lifetime of similar work ahead. It was, in its own harsh way, both an economic necessity for struggling families and an early introduction to the rigid hierarchy that would likely shape the rest of their working lives. Whatever childhood you remember, however ordinary or difficult, know that many children in this era never had the luxury of simply being children for very long at all. But that is only one small part of the story. Apprenticeship and service, for many, meant years bound by a single signed agreement. A servant once contracted, often through an indenture, a formal legal document, typically owed years of labor to a single household or master, sometimes 7 years or more, much like the well-known apprenticeships of skilled trades. During this time, leaving early without permission could mean legal trouble, lost wages, or being labeled unreliable in a community where reputation traveled faster than almost anything else. This meant a servant's fate, for years at a stretch, depended enormously on the character of the household they'd been placed with. A fair, reasonably kind master could make years of hard labor bearable. A cruel or neglectful one could make those same years almost unbearable, with little legal recourse and few places to turn for help. There's a quiet tension in imagining that kind of commitment, years of your life, tied to the temperament of someone else entirely, with so little say in how gently or harshly those years might unfold. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Marriage, for many servants, was something to be delayed, sometimes for years. Many households expected unmarried service, especially from live-in servants, since married servants with their own households were harder to manage and less available around the clock. Some contracts explicitly forbade marriage during the term of service, meaning a young servant might spend their most eligible years bound instead to someone else's household, postponing their own family until their service finally ended. This shaped entire lives in quiet ways: later marriages, longer periods of independence before starting a family, sometimes entire relationships delayed for years simply because both partners remained tied to separate households, unable to leave without breaking a binding agreement. Love, in this world, often had to wait patiently for contracts to expire. It's strange to imagine a version of life or even something as personal as who and when you love was quietly shaped by the fine print of someone else's household needs. But that is only one small part of the story. Illness spread easily in a household built on close, shared quarters, with servants often sleeping several to a room, sharing bedding, working closely together over food and fires all day. Disease could move through a household's lower ranks with alarming speed. Plague, in particular, was a constant looming fear throughout the Tudor period, capable of emptying entire households within weeks, striking servants and masters alike. Though servants often had far less means to flee to a safer countryside estate when outbreaks hit crowded towns. Even smaller illnesses, colds, fevers, stomach troubles, spread quickly through shared spoons, shared beds, shared basins of water, without any understanding yet of how germs traveled from one tired body to the next. A servant falling seriously ill might simply be dismissed from service entirely, losing both income and shelter at the exact moment they needed care the most. Tonight, whatever small ache or tiredness you carry, know it exists in a world with far more understanding, far more care than the one we're gently wandering through together. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were simply an accepted, unglamorous part of daily life. Straw mattresses, shared bedding, infrequent washing of both bodies and clothes. All of this created near-perfect conditions for small pests to thrive, and Tudor servants, much like most people of the era, simply lived alongside them rather than eliminating them entirely. Scratching, picking through hair for lice, shaking out bedding in hopes of dislodging fleas. These were unremarkable, everyday habits, rarely worth mentioning in any letter or diary because they were simply too ordinary to note. Some households used strong-smelling herbs, rue, wormwood, tansy, tucked into bedding or scattered on floors, believed to discourage pests, with mixed and largely unproven success. For the most part, people simply endured these small itching companions as an unavoidable feature of being alive in a world without modern pest control or regular bathing. However uncomfortable your bed feels tonight, take one small, quiet moment of gratitude. Whatever discomfort remains, it is almost certainly nothing like what centuries of tired bodies simply learned to live alongside. But that is only one small part of the story. Bathing, as we understand it now, happened rarely. Sometimes only a handful of times each year. Full baths required enormous effort, heating large quantities of water over an open fire, filling a wooden tub, and often sharing that same water among several household members before it cooled or grew too dirty to use again. For a servant, finding the time, fuel, and privacy for a proper bath was a luxury rarely available. Tucked between endless other duties, that never seemed to pause long enough to allow it. Instead, most people relied on what we might now call dry washing, wiping down with a damp cloth, changing the linen shift worn beneath outer clothing more often than washing the body itself. Since linen could absorb sweat and be laundered more easily than a whole body could be bathed. Strong scents were simply part of daily life, noticed far less than we might imagine, because everyone around you smelled roughly the same. Tonight, whatever comfort of cleanliness surrounds you, remember it as something remarkably new. A privilege many generations before you never once experienced so simply, so often, so easily. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Below stairs and above stairs were, in many great houses, almost two separate worlds under one roof. Wealthier Tudor households increasingly built with this separation in mind. Grand rooms and staircases for the family and their guests, hidden narrow passageways, and back staircases for servants to move unseen between kitchen, hall, and bedchamber. A servant might spend an entire working life inside a house whose finest rooms they rarely, if ever, properly entered, moving instead through dim corridors built specifically to keep their labor invisible. This architecture reflected something deeper about how the household understood itself, comfort and beauty upstairs, effort and mess carefully hidden below. Two entirely different experiences of the very same building. A servant's whole working world might be confined to kitchen, scullery, and a few narrow passageways, while just beyond a single door lay rooms of firelight, tapestry, and warmth they would rarely pause long enough to admire. It's a strange thing to imagine, spending your whole life inside a beautiful house and still never quite living inside its beauty at all. But that is only one small part of the story. Washing dishes in a Tudor scullery meant cold water, harsh materials, and endless repetition. Without modern dish soap, scullery servants often relied on sand, ash, or rough scouring materials to scrub grease and food residue from pewter, wood, and earthenware. Water for this task was frequently cold, since heating enough water for washing every dish, pot, and pan of a large household would have consumed more fuel than most kitchens could spare. Hands grew rough and cracked from this constant exposure. A quiet, permanent mark of a lifetime spent in service. This task, low in status, but constant in demand, often fell to the youngest or newest servants in the kitchen hierarchy, a starting point from which, with luck and time, a servant might slowly rise toward slightly less punishing work. For many, though, scullery work remained their entire working life, unglamorous and unending, meal after meal, day after day. There's something almost soothing from this safe distance in imagining repetitive, simple motion. Scrub, rinse, stack again. even while remembering how little comfort it truly offered the hands doing the work. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Caring for horses meant working outdoors in every kind of weather, regardless of comfort. Grooms and stable hands rose early to feed, water, and muck out stalls before the family's day even properly began. Since horses needed tending, whether rain fell or frost coated the ground. This work required physical strength, patience with large, sometimes unpredictable animals, and a tolerance for cold, wet, and unglamorous labor that never fully paused, even on the household's rare rest days. A good groom also needed real skill, understanding a horse's temperament, treating minor injuries, keeping tack clean and supple with careful oiling, ensuring the family's horses were always ready for sudden travel at a moment's notice. This blend of physical labor and quiet expertise made skilled grooms genuinely valuable, even while their daily reality remained cold hands, muddy boots, and long hours spent mostly alone with the animals in their care. There's a certain steadiness in imagining this life, hard, yes, but perhaps also quiet outdoors, away from the tighter hierarchies of the busy kitchen and hall. But that is only one small part of the story. The kitchen itself was a strange mix of unbearable heat and constant draft. Standing near an open hearth for hours meant intense, dry heat on your face and arms, sweat forming even in the depths of winter, while just a few steps away, drafts crept through poorly sealed windows and doors, chilling your back the moment you turned away from the fire. Kitchen servants lived inside this constant contradiction, roasting on one side, shivering on the other, an uncomfortable, uneven warmth that never quite settled evenly across the body. Smoke, too, filled these spaces more than we might imagine, since chimneys of the era often drew imperfectly, leaving a faint haze lingering near the ceiling, stinging eyes, and settling into clothes and hair after a long day's work. A kitchen servant likely smelled of wood smoke long after leaving the room, a scent that clung stubbornly no matter how often clothes were aired. Tonight, wherever you rest, notice the evenness of your own comfort. No open flame demanding closeness, no draft creeping in behind you, just steady, gentle warmth surrounding you completely. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Most servants could neither read nor write, learning their entire trade through watching, listening, and repetition alone. Formal education was rare among the lower servant classes, meaning skills, how to properly lay a fire, how to season a particular dish, how to fold linen just so, passed down entirely through spoken instruction and careful imitation. A new servant learned by watching an older one, making mistakes, being corrected, and slowly building a memory of countless small procedures with no written recipe or manual to consult when memory failed. This oral tradition meant household knowledge was deeply personal, tied closely to whoever taught you, carrying small variations from house to house, family to family, region to region. A servant's competence was, in many ways, a living archive of everything they'd been shown and had managed to remember correctly, with no page to flip back to when uncertainty crept in. There's something quietly impressive in imagining a whole working life built entirely on memory and careful watching. No notes, no manual, just trust in what your hands had learned to do. But that is only one small part of the story. A servant's reputation, once damaged, could follow them for the rest of their working life. Dismissal without a proper reference, a written or spoken acknowledgement of honest, reliable service, could make finding future employment extremely difficult, since prospective employers relied heavily on word of mouth and personal recommendation rather than any formal system we might recognize today. A servant accused of theft, laziness, or disobedience, whether fairly or unfairly, risked being effectively unemployable within their local community for years afterward. This made a servant's daily conduct enormously consequential. Every small task, a quiet contribution to a reputation that could open doors to better positions or close them permanently. Loyalty, discretion, and reliability weren't just personal virtues in this world. They were, quite literally, economic survival, the invisible currency that determined whether a servant's future held any improvement at all. It's worth noticing, gently, how much weight rested on simply being seen as trustworthy in a world offering so few second chances to those who slipped. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The privy or garderobe was often cold, dark, and genuinely unpleasant to visit. In larger houses, a garderobe was sometimes built as a small stone alcove jutting from an outer wall, allowing waste to drop directly outside into a pit or moat below. These spaces were drafty, often unlit at night, and carried a smell that never fully disappeared, no matter how often they were cleaned. For lower servants, using and maintaining these spaces was simply another unremarkable part of daily life, tolerated because there was no better alternative available anywhere nearby. Cleaning and maintaining a garderobe pit was among the least desirable tasks in the entire household, sometimes contracted out entirely to specialized workers who traveled between properties for this singular, unglamorous purpose. Even the language of the era tried gently to soften the reality. Necessary house, some called it. A small kindness of phrasing for an entirely unkind task. Whatever small comforts of modern plumbing exist around you tonight, let yourself notice them quietly as something remarkably recent in the long, slow story of human comfort. But that is only one small part of the story. Seasonal tasks shaped a servant's year as much as daily chores shaped their day. Autumn brought the heavy work of preserving food for winter, salting meat, smoking fish, storing grain, pickling vegetables. Labor-intensive tasks requiring careful timing before the household's food supply had to last through the leaner, colder months ahead. Winter brought its own demands, enormous quantities of firewood to gather and carry, animals needing extra care against the cold, and the constant battle to keep drafty rooms even minimally warm. Spring meant planting, cleaning out winter's accumulated grime, airing out rooms closed against the cold for months. Summer brought harvest work, longer daylight hours stretching the working day even further, and the delicate task of preserving perishable food before it spoiled in the heat. A servant's body, across a single year, moved through an entirely different rhythm of labor with each turning season, never truly resting, only shifting what kind of effort was required. There's something almost beautiful from this gentle distance in imagining a whole life so closely tied to the turning of seasons, each one asking something different, each one eventually passing into the next. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even sleep itself was rarely private, rarely uninterrupted, rarely entirely one's own. Many servants, especially those attending closely to a master or mistress, slept in truckle beds, low, wheeled frames stored beneath the main bed during the day and pulled out at night, positioned so they could be woken instantly if needed. A lady's maid might sleep just steps from her mistress's door, ready to respond to a call for water, warmth, or comfort at any hour. Her own rest always secondary to someone else's potential need. This meant a servant's sleep was often light, easily broken, never quite as deep or restorative as we might hope for ourselves tonight. Waking suddenly to attend to someone else, then trying to fall back asleep in a cold room before the next early morning's work began. This cycle repeated itself, night after night, for entire careers spent in close personal service. Tonight, your sleep belongs entirely to you, uninterrupted by anyone else's needs. Let that simple truth settle over you now, heavier and softer than any blanket. But that is only one small part of the story. Brewing was not the only skilled task a household relied on servants to master quietly. Candle making, cheese making, herb drying for medicine, preserving fruit in honey or sugar when it could be afforded. Dozens of small, specialized skills existed within a well-run Tudor household, each one usually mastered by a particular servant who became, in effect, quietly indispensable. These weren't formally recognized trades with guild certificates or official titles, yet they required real expertise, patience, and years of accumulated, careful practice. A servant skilled in herbal remedies might be quietly relied upon whenever illness struck the household, blending knowledge of local plants with whatever folk wisdom had been passed down to them. This kind of expertise offered a small, unspoken form of value and even respect within the household's rigid hierarchy. Proof that skill, even without formal recognition, still mattered enormously to daily survival. There's a quiet dignity in imagining this. Expertise built slowly, unglamorously, over years, valued not through titles or certificates, but simply through being reliably, consistently good at something the whole household depended on. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. A servant's body carried the visible, permanent marks of this labor for their entire life. Years of kneeling before fires left knees stiff and aching well before old age arrived. Hands cracked and calloused from cold water, lye, and rough materials, rarely softened again, no matter how much time passed. Backs curved slightly from decades of bending, over wash tubs, over hearths, over gardens. A quiet, physical record of a lifetime spent in service to someone else's comfort. Even eyesight often suffered, strained for years by dim rushlight or candlelight, while mending, sewing, or reading whatever small instructions a household required. A servant's body, by middle age, told the entire story of their working life more honestly than any written record ever could. Worn and shaped by thousands of repeated motions, performed in service to someone else's ease. Whatever tiredness rests in your own body tonight, know it is temporary, healing, and entirely your own to release, not a permanent mark left by a lifetime spent laboring for another's comfort. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every household was cruel, and not every servant's life was unrelenting hardship. Some households, particularly smaller, more modest ones, treated servants more like extended family, sharing meals together, offering genuine kindness, allowing small comforts and occasional real rest. A good master or mistress understood that a well-treated servant worked more willingly, more loyally, and often stayed far longer than one who was merely tolerated or feared. Long-serving, trusted servants sometimes rose to genuine positions of household authority. A steward managing an entire estate's finances, a head cook commanding real respect within the kitchen's hierarchy, a lady's maid becoming a true confidant rather than simply hired help. These relationships, built slowly over years of shared daily life, could hold real warmth, real loyalty, even real affection, quietly complicating the simpler, harsher picture we might otherwise imagine. It's worth remembering gently that even within a difficult system, human kindness still found its way through quietly in countless small households across the country. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even the smallest daily comforts were carefully, deliberately noticed and appreciated. A servant might treasure a particularly warm corner near the kitchen fire on a cold night, a rare, quiet moment alone in the garden before the household woke, a kind word from a mistress who noticed real effort rather than simply expecting it. These small, unremarkable pleasures, warmth, quiet, brief kindness, carried enormous weight in a life offering so few larger comforts to hold on to. This is, perhaps, something worth carrying forward from this whole long story. That comfort doesn't need to be large to matter deeply. A warm fire, a quiet moment, a kind word. These small things sustained entire lives once, and they can still, quietly, sustain yours tonight. Let yourself notice, gently, whatever small comfort surrounds you right now, warmth, softness, quiet, and let it feel like enough, because it always was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. By the time evening properly arrived, a servant's body had usually given everything it had left to give. The final tasks of the day, banking the fire again for the night, checking that doors were secured, laying out whatever the family would need come morning, were often completed in a kind of quiet exhaustion, muscle memory carrying hands through motions. The mind was almost too tired to fully register. And then, finally, the pallet, the truckle bed, the thin mattress, whatever small resting place waited, welcomed with real, deep relief. Sleep, when it finally came completely, pulling a tired body down into stillness within minutes, sometimes seconds, of finally lying still. There was little room for racing thoughts or restless turning when true physical exhaustion took hold this deeply, this honestly, night after night. Perhaps there's something to borrow from this, gently, right now. Permission to let your own tired body sink down completely, fully, the way theirs once did, with nothing left to hold onto but rest. Carving meat at the table was, surprisingly, a genuine skill with its own quiet prestige. In a great household, carving wasn't simply hacking a joint of meat apart. It followed careful, almost ceremonial rules, different cuts for different birds and beasts, different phrases even used for each one. A skilled carver, often a higher-ranking servant, needed steady hands and real knowledge, since serving the master's table clumsily could reflect poorly on the entire household's reputation in front of important guests. Manuals of the era actually described proper carving in careful detail, teaching servants which words to use, which angle to cut, how to present each portion with a kind of quiet elegance. This was one of the few servant tasks performed directly in front of the family and their guests, meaning it carried more visibility and more pressure than most invisible labor happening elsewhere in the house. There's something almost graceful in imagining it now, careful, practiced hands. A small moment of visible skill inside a life otherwise spent mostly unseen. But that is only one small part of the story. What you drank, much like what you wore, quietly announced your place in the household. Wine, particularly imported wine, was reserved almost entirely for the family and their most honored guests, while servants drank ale or the weaker small beer described earlier. Even among servants themselves, subtle differences existed. A steward or head cook might occasionally share a cup of something finer, while the youngest kitchen boy drank whatever was plainest and most plentiful. This careful rationing wasn't simply about cost, though cost mattered enormously. It was also about status, about visibly marking who belonged where within the household's rigid structure, down to the very cup in someone's hand. A servant learned early exactly what they were permitted to drink, and rarely questioned it, because questioning it risked far more than a moment's thirst. Tonight, whatever rests near you, water, tea, nothing at all, belongs entirely to your own choosing, with no hierarchy watching to measure what it says about your place in the world. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Someone in the household usually understood plants well enough to keep the family healthy. Long before modern medicine, households relied on herb gardens, tended often by a servant with real, careful knowledge of what grew there. Lavender for headaches, chamomile to calm a restless stomach, comfrey for bruises and minor wounds. This knowledge passed quietly from servant to servant, tested through generations of trial, observation, and inherited wisdom, rather than anything written in a formal book. Tending this garden required patience across the whole year, planting in spring, harvesting at precisely the right moment, drying and storing herbs correctly so their potency lasted through winter months when illness struck more often. A servant skilled in this quiet expertise became genuinely valuable, trusted with the household's health in ways that went far beyond simple domestic labor. There's a gentle comfort in imagining this. Quiet garden rows, careful hands, and knowledge good enough to ease real suffering, passed down without a single word ever written. But that is only one small part of the story. The floors beneath everyone's feet were not bare wood or stone, but a layer of scattered rushes and sweet herbs. Before carpets became common, floors in many Tudor homes were strewn with rushes, a kind of reed mixed sometimes with fragrant herbs like meadowsweet or lavender, meant to soften footsteps and mask less pleasant smells rising from below. Servants were responsible for laying these rushes fresh, then quietly removing and replacing them once they grew soiled, trampled, and stale beneath the household's constant footsteps. This was unglamorous, ongoing work, sweeping out old rushes, thick with dropped food, dust, and worse, then carefully laying fresh ones in careful, even layers across the hall. A truly well-kept household prided itself on rushes changed often enough that unpleasant smells never quite had the chance to settle in. Whatever surface rests beneath you tonight, soft, clean, simply there, without a servant's quiet effort behind it. Let yourself notice, gently, how much unseen work such simple comfort once required. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some servants provided the household's music, filling quiet evenings with something more than silence. Larger households sometimes employed servants specifically for their musical skill. A lute player, a singer, someone able to entertain guests after supper with careful, practiced melodies. These servants occupied a curious middle position, valued for a genuine talent that set them apart from purely physical labor, yet still bound by the same rigid hierarchy as everyone else below the family's table. Learning an instrument well enough to perform for wealthy, discerning guests took years of quiet practice, often squeezed into whatever small moments remained after other duties were finished. A servant with real musical gift might travel between grand houses, their skill opening doors that pure physical labor never could, even while their fundamental status as a servant remained largely unchanged. There's something lovely in imagining it. A quiet evening hall, firelight flickering, and somewhere in the shadows, a servant's careful, practiced music drifting gently over the room. But that is only one small part of the story. The steward held a strange, powerful position, a servant, yet one who commanded servants beneath him. Above the cooks, the maids, the grooms, and the scullions stood the steward, responsible for managing the household's accounts, overseeing staff, and ensuring the whole complicated machine of daily life ran smoothly. This was a position of genuine trust and real authority, often held by someone who had risen slowly through years of loyal, careful service, learning every corner of the household along the way. A good steward needed to read, write, and calculate skills far beyond what most lower servants ever learned, making this one of the rare paths through which a servant's life could meaningfully improve, gaining respect, better lodging, and wages far beyond what a scullery maid or stable boy could ever hope to earn. Yet, even a steward remained, ultimately, still a servant, answerable entirely to the family whose house he managed. It's worth noticing gently how even within such a rigid system, there was still room occasionally for quiet advancement through skill, trust, and time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Someone always had to stay half awake, listening in case fire or danger crept in during the night. Fire was a constant, serious fear in homes built largely of wood, thatch, and open flame, and larger households sometimes assigned a servant to a kind of quiet night watch, checking hearths were properly banked, listening for any unusual sound, ensuring doors remained secure against intruders in the dark. This was lonely, watchful work, performed while the rest of the household slept soundly, trusting someone else to notice danger before it noticed them. A servant on night watch walked softly through dark corridors by dim rushlight, pausing at each room, each hearth, each door, carrying the quiet weight of an entire household's safety on their tired shoulders, until dawn finally arrived to relieve them. It was work built almost entirely on trust that they would stay alert, trust that they would notice what needed noticing, long after everyone else had stopped paying attention. Tonight, no such duty rests on your shoulders. You are allowed to sleep completely, fully, trusting that nothing requires your careful watching tonight at all. But that is only one small part of the story. Many households grew much of their own food, and someone had to tend it, season after season. Kitchen gardens supplied vegetables, herbs, and sometimes fruit for the household's table, requiring near constant care, weeding, watering, protecting young plants from pests and weather, harvesting at exactly the right moment before produce spoiled or turned bitter. This work fell often to servants with a particular patience for growing things, tending rows quietly through long afternoons between their other, more urgent duties. A good kitchen garden could meaningfully reduce a household's dependence on costly bought produce, making the servant who tended it quietly valuable in ways rarely acknowledged directly. Rain, frost, and unexpected weather could undo weeks of careful work in a single unlucky night, meaning this labor carried its own particular, patient anxiety through every growing season. There's a certain quiet satisfaction in imagining it, hands in soil, watching something grow slowly under careful attention, a rare kind of labor that offered its own visible, tangible reward. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. When a family traveled between their various estates, their servants had little choice but to travel too. Wealthier Tudor families often owned multiple properties, moving between them through the year for reasons of business, health, or simple seasonal preference. And much of the household staff moved along with them, packing entire lives into carts and wagons for journeys along rough, unpredictable roads. This meant a servant's sense of home was often unstable, shifting between locations several times a year, rarely settling anywhere long enough to feel entirely their own. These journeys themselves were physically demanding: muddy roads, unpredictable weather, heavy loads requiring careful loading, and constant watching to prevent theft or damage along the way. A servant might travel further in a single year than most people of their status would travel in an entire lifetime otherwise, carried along entirely by the family's own restless movement. Whatever place you call home tonight, let yourself notice the simple stability of it: walls that stay put, a bed that doesn't change with someone else's shifting plans. But that is only one small part of the story. Some servants spent much of their working life simply carrying messages, on foot, across long distances. Before reliable postal systems, urgent messages between households, business partners, or family members often traveled by a servant sent running or riding, covering considerable distances regardless of weather, road conditions, or their own exhaustion. A message servant needed to be trusted completely, since they often carried sensitive, sometimes valuable information entirely by memory, or in a sealed letter they couldn't read themselves. This work brought its own dangers: poor roads, unpredictable weather, occasional threats from robbers along quieter stretches of countryside, all faced largely alone, with only the urgency of the message pushing them steadily forward. A particularly reliable messenger servant might become genuinely valued for their speed and discretion, trusted repeatedly with matters too important to risk on anyone less dependable. There's something quietly admirable in imagining it. Someone alone on a long road, carrying words that weren't their own, trusted completely to deliver them safely. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The great hall itself was arranged with careful, deliberate hierarchy, visible in every table and seat. At one end sat the high table, raised slightly above the rest of the room, where the family and their most honored guests ate in clear view of everyone below. Lower tables stretched down the hall for lesser guests and higher servants, while the very lowest servants often ate separately altogether in the kitchen or a smaller adjoining room, entirely out of sight from the grander occasion above. This arrangement wasn't accidental. It was a constant, visible reminder of exactly where everyone stood, reinforced meal after meal, day after day, until the hierarchy felt less like an arrangement and more like simply the natural order of things. Servants moved quietly between these tables, serving upward through the ranks, watching a version of the world's order play out fresh at every single meal. Tonight, wherever you find yourself resting, there is no table above you, no rank quietly measuring your place in the room. You simply are exactly where you are, and that is entirely enough. But that is only one small part of the story. Caring for a household's infants and young children fell to nursery maids and wet nurses, work both tender and exhausting. A wet nurse, often a servant brought specifically for this purpose, fed and cared for infants around the clock. Her own life reorganized entirely around a baby that wasn't hers, day and night, for as long as the position required. Nursery maids beyond infancy managed young children's daily needs, dressing, feeding, teaching basic manners, keeping them safe from the countless small dangers of a busy household full of open fires and uneven stairs. This work required genuine tenderness alongside its physical exhaustion. Long nights broken by a crying infant, long days chasing after energetic, curious children through unsafe corridors. Some nursery maids formed deep, lasting bonds with the children in their care, bonds that could last years, even as the formal distance of servant and family remained quietly, permanently in place. There's something gently moving in imagining this real tenderness, offered patiently, inside a relationship the world outside never quite let become equal. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Fine furnishings required delicate, careful cleaning that could not simply be rushed through. Tapestries, valuable and often irreplaceable, needed gentle brushing rather than harsh scrubbing. Dust and grime lifted slowly and patiently to avoid damaging threads that had taken weavers months or years to complete. Fine wooden furniture required careful polishing with beeswax, applied and buffed by hand until the surface glowed softly in candlelight. A slow, meditative task requiring real patience rather than any particular strength. A servant entrusted with this delicate work carried real responsibility, since damaging an expensive tapestry or piece of furniture could mean serious consequences, financial and otherwise, for a household that measured such objects in years of careful investment. This was quieter work than kitchen labor, but no less demanding in its own particular, careful way. There's a certain calm in imagining it. Slow, deliberate hands, soft cloth against old wood, care taken simply because the object deserved it. But that is only one small part of the story. Clothing, in a world without easy replacement, required constant sewing and careful mending. Torn seams, worn elbows, loosened buttons, all of it needed regular attention, since clothing represented real, considerable expense that no household wanted wasted through neglect. Servants skilled with a needle spent long evening hours mending garments by candlelight or rushlight, small stitches, accumulating slowly across worn fabric that would otherwise have been discarded entirely. This quiet, repetitive work required good eyesight and patient hands, often straining both after a long day already spent on other physical labor. A servant particularly skilled at fine needlework might be specifically assigned this task, their careful stitches invisible in the finished garment, yet essential to the household's ongoing, careful economy. Whatever you're wrapped in tonight, however it came to you, let yourself imagine, just briefly, the quiet patience once required simply to keep clothing wearable at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Being sent out into bad weather was simply an accepted risk of a servant's working life. Storms, snow, flooding roads, none of it excused a servant from an urgent errand if the household required it, whether fetching a physician, delivering an important message, or simply gathering supplies that couldn't wait for better conditions. Servants walked or rode through genuinely dangerous, whether more often than we might imagine. Their own safety weighed quietly against the household's more pressing, immediate needs. This meant real physical danger, hypothermia, dangerous river crossings, treacherous icy roads, accepted simply as part of the job, rarely discussed, rarely compensated with anything beyond the satisfaction of having completed the task successfully. A servant's body, once again, absorbed risks that the comfortable household above rarely had to consider directly for themselves. Tonight, whatever weather moves outside your window, it asks nothing of you. You are not being sent anywhere. You are allowed completely to simply stay. But that is only one small part of the story. Within the kitchen itself, an entire small hierarchy shaped every single day's work. The head cook commanded real authority, planning meals, managing ingredients, answering directly to the steward or the family itself, while beneath them worked undercooks handling specific tasks, sauces, baking, roasting, each one slowly gaining skill and trust over years of careful practice. Below even them stood the scullions, doing the roughest, least skilled work, hoping patiently for the chance to rise slowly through these careful ranks themselves. This structure meant a kitchen ran with surprising precision despite its chaos. Everyone understanding exactly their role, exactly whose instructions to follow, exactly how their own small task fit into the much larger, more complicated whole. Rising through these ranks took years of proving yourself reliable, skilled, and trustworthy, one small task at a time. There's something oddly comforting in imagining such careful order beneath apparent chaos. Everyone, in their own quiet way, knowing exactly where they belonged. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Servants were often summoned not by name, but by the ring of a bell. Larger households sometimes installed simple bell systems, pulled from various rooms, each connected to a corresponding bell below stairs. its particular sound or position, telling servants exactly which room required their attention. This meant a servant's day was punctuated constantly by small, sudden interruptions, a bell ringing, a task abandoned mid-motion, hurrying toward whatever need had just been announced from somewhere above. Living under this constant possibility of interruption shaped a servant's whole relationship with time itself, never quite settling fully into one task, always half listening for the next small summons that could arrive at any moment. Even brief pauses for food or rest carried this quiet tension, an awareness that stillness could end at any moment with a single distant, insistent ring. Tonight, no bell waits to summon you anywhere. Whatever stillness you're resting in now is allowed to simply continue, uninterrupted, for as long as you need it. But that is only one small part of the story. Guarding the household's food stores was a quiet, constant responsibility. The larder held the family's careful stock of preserved meat, grain, and other valuable provisions meant to last through leaner months. And someone needed to watch over it carefully against spoilage, against pests, and sometimes against theft, whether from outside the household or from within its own hungry ranks. A servant entrusted with this key carried real responsibility, since mismanaging these stores could mean genuine hardship for the entire household before the next harvest arrived. This role required careful record keeping, even without formal writing, a kind of mental inventory tracking exactly what remained and how long it needed to last. Losing track or losing food to careless spoilage reflected poorly on whoever held this quiet, trusted responsibility, making it work that demanded real attention even when nothing appeared to be happening at all. There's a quiet steadiness in imagining this kind of watchfulness, careful, patient, protecting something the whole household depended on without ever needing applause for doing it well. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even with fires burning steadily, Tudor houses remained genuinely, persistently cold through winter months. Thick stone walls, small windows, and imperfect draft-proofing meant heat from even a well-tended fire rarely spread evenly through a whole room, let alone an entire house, leaving corners and hallways bitterly cold no matter how carefully servants tended every hearth. Servants often layered whatever clothing they owned, wrapping themselves as warmly as possible, while still moving efficiently through their many daily tasks. This persistent cold shaped nearly everything about a Tudor winter. Shorter outdoor tasks, more time spent huddled near whatever fire was available, careful conservation of firewood that itself required considerable labor simply to gather and store. A servant's whole body adjusted slowly to a level of persistent chill that we might find genuinely difficult to tolerate today. Whatever warmth surrounds you now, however steady and complete, let it feel like a small, quiet luxury, one that took centuries of gradual comfort to finally become so simply, reliably available. A servant's whole life often fit inside a single small wooden chest. Personal belongings were few, perhaps a spare shift, a small keepsake from home, a coin or two saved slowly over months of modest wages, a comb, maybe a small religious token carried for comfort. This chest, if a servant had one at all, represented nearly everything they owned in the world, kept close, sometimes locked, tucked beneath a pallet, or in a shared corner of a crowded sleeping space. There was something quietly poignant in how little this amounted to. An entire life's possessions small enough to carry in 2 arms, should a servant ever need to leave quickly, whether by choice or by dismissal. And yet, within that smallness, small treasures still mattered enormously. Each item chosen carefully, kept safe, worth far more to its owner than its modest value might suggest to anyone else. Whatever surrounds you tonight, however much or little, let yourself notice it gently. You are allowed simply to have enough, without needing to measure it against anyone else's abundance. But that is only one small part of the story. At certain times of year, even the strictest households allowed small gifts and modest kindness toward their servants. Around the Christmas season particularly, some households offered small boxes of coins, food, or leftover goods to their servants. A tradition some historians trace toward what later became known as Boxing Day. This wasn't universal generosity, and it certainly didn't erase the harder realities of daily service, but it did offer small, genuine moments of warmth within an otherwise rigid, unequal relationship. A kind household might also mark a servant's long, loyal years with a slightly better position, a small increase in wages, or simply consistent, genuine appreciation, expressed quietly rather than through any grand gesture. These small kindnesses, modest as they were, could make the difference between a servant who felt merely used and one who felt, in some real, if limited way, valued. There's something worth holding on to in this, that even inside difficult systems, small, genuine kindnesses still found their way through, quietly, meaningfully, when people chose to offer them. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. When the family celebrated a wedding or mourned a death, servants carried much of the ceremony's quiet weight. A wedding meant weeks of extra preparation, special foods, cleaned and polished rooms, careful arrangements for visiting guests, all resting on servants' already considerable daily workload. A death meant something heavier still, preparing the body according to careful custom, managing a household deep in mourning, maintaining normal daily function, even while grief settled over everyone above stairs. Servants who had served a family for years sometimes felt these losses genuinely themselves, having watched children grow, having quietly witnessed decades of a family's private joys and sorrows from just close enough to care, yet just far enough to never truly belong to the grief being properly, publicly mourned. Their own feelings in these moments rarely had space to be expressed, folded quietly back into the next necessary task. There's something tender in imagining this, witnessing a family's most significant moments closely, repeatedly, while never quite being permitted to grieve or celebrate as fully as your own presence and care might have earned. But that is only one small part of the story. Growing old in service brought its own quiet uncertainty, without pensions or guaranteed care. An aging servant, no longer able to manage the physical demands of kitchen or stable work, faced real uncertainty about what came next. Some kind households found lighter positions for long-serving elderly staff, or continued modest support out of loyalty and genuine gratitude for years of faithful service. Others, less generous, simply let older servants go, leaving them to rely on whatever family, savings, or charity remained available. This uncertainty shaped how a servant approached their entire working life. The quiet, constant awareness that physical labor, their primary and often only source of income, would not last forever, and that little formal safety net existed to catch them when it finally failed. Loyalty and reputation, built carefully across years, became a servant's best hope for some measure of security in age. Whatever security surrounds your own life tonight, let it feel, for just a moment, like something worth quiet gratitude. A kind of certainty many working lives before yours never fully had the comfort of holding. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. A servant's daily life could look genuinely different depending on whether their household sat in a bustling city or a quiet countryside estate. In London, a servant moved through crowded, noisy streets, running errands past merchants, pickpockets, and the general chaos of a growing city, their days shaped by urban rhythms, nearby markets, close neighbors, the particular smells and sounds of city life pressing in from every direction. In the countryside, a servant's world instead stretched across fields, gardens, and quieter lanes, shaped by seasons, weather, and the slower rhythms of rural life rather than urban bustle. Wages, opportunities, and even daily tasks shifted meaningfully between these settings. A country servant might tend animals and gardens unfamiliar to their city counterparts, while a London servant navigated errands through crowds and dangers a countryside a state rarely presented. Neither life was simpler than the other, only differently shaped by the particular world surrounding it. There's something worth appreciating in this variety, that even within one broad category of life, servant, countless different daily realities quietly existed side by side. But that is only one small part of the story. The relationship between household and local tradesmen shaped much of a servant's daily errands. Someone from the household, often a trusted servant, needed to visit the local market, negotiate with butchers, bakers, and merchants, judge freshness and fairness of price with a careful, practiced eye developed over years of experience. This required real skill, knowing which merchant could be trusted, which cuts of meat were genuinely fresh, how to negotiate firmly but respectfully within a small community where reputation mattered enormously on both sides of every transaction. A servant skilled in this quiet diplomacy became genuinely valuable to a household's daily economy, saving money through careful negotiation, avoiding poor quality goods through careful judgment, built slowly over repeated visits to the same familiar stalls and shops. This work connected the household's private world to the wider, bustling community surrounding it, one careful daily errand at a time. There's something almost pleasant in imagining it now. From this gentle distance, familiar faces, familiar stalls, small daily conversations woven quietly into the fabric of an otherwise demanding life. The dairy maid's day revolved entirely around the patient, careful rhythms of milk, milking cows before dawn, then again in the evening. A dairy maid's hands grew strong and sure from years of this repeated motion, coaxing warm milk into wooden pails in the quiet, animal-scented dark of a barn before the rest of the house had properly woken. From there, milk needed careful, immediate handling. Some kept fresh for drinking, some set aside to separate into cream, some turned patiently into butter or cheese through slow, careful churning and pressing. This work demanded real skill and constant attention, since milk spoiled quickly without proper care, and a batch of butter or cheese gone wrong meant real, wasted effort and lost food the household depended on. A good dairy maid understood exactly how long to churn, exactly how much salt to add, exactly how long cheese needed to rest and age before it was ready. Knowledge held entirely in careful, practiced hands rather than any written recipe. There's a quiet, steady rhythm in imagining this life. Early mornings, warm milk, patient hands, turning something simple into something that would nourish an entire household through colder months ahead. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Bread, the most basic food of the entire household, required its own long, careful process before it ever reached a single table. Someone needed to grind or purchase flour, prepare and knead dough by hand, tend a proper rise, then manage a hot, unpredictable oven built of brick or stone, judging heat entirely by feel and experience rather than any dial or thermometer. Bread for the family was often made from finer, whiter flour, while servants themselves ate coarser, darker bread made from whatever remained. A small, quiet distinction present even in something as basic as daily bread. The bakehouse itself ran hot and demanding, loaves needing careful timing to avoid burning, dough needing gentle, practiced handling to rise properly in temperamental ovens that offered no easy way to check progress beyond opening the door and hoping. A servant skilled in this work provided something the entire household depended on completely, meal after meal, day after day, without much thought ever given to how much quiet skill it truly required. There's something grounding in imagining it now flour dust, settling in evening light, the good, warm smell of bread rising slowly through a busy kitchen. But that is only one small part of the story. Fear of accusation, of theft, laziness, or simple failure quietly shadowed even the most honest servant's daily life. A missing spoon, a broken dish, coins that didn't quite add up correctly. Any of these small mishaps could fall, fairly or unfairly, onto whichever servant happened to be nearby. And defending yourself against such accusations was rarely simple in a world where a master's word carried far more weight than a servant's. This meant many servants moved through their days with a quiet, background wariness, careful not just to be honest, but to be seen clearly as honest, since perception mattered nearly as much as truth itself. Some households handled these situations fairly, investigating carefully before assigning blame. Others acted swiftly and harshly, dismissing a servant on suspicion alone, with little opportunity to properly explain or defend themselves against whatever had gone wrong. This uncertainty added its own quiet, constant weight to lives already carrying considerable physical burden. Whatever worries followed you into tonight, let them be lighter than this. You are not being quietly watched, quietly measured, quietly at risk of losing everything over someone else's small mistake. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. When illness struck the family itself, servants often became quiet, exhausted nurses alongside their normal duties. Caring for a sick master or mistress meant additional long nights, fetching remedies, changing linens, sitting close by through fevered, restless hours, all while still somehow managing whatever daily tasks hadn't simply paused because of the household's worry. This nursing work required real tenderness, patience, and physical stamina, often performed by servants already exhausted from their ordinary daily labor. stretched now even further by genuine concern for someone they'd served, sometimes for years. A servant's own health rarely received the same careful attention in return. Illness among servants was often expected to be endured quietly, worked through if at all possible, since a household's daily function depended on hands that kept moving regardless of how they themselves were feeling. This quiet imbalance, deep care given, rarely matched by care received, shaped much of what service ultimately meant. Tonight, whatever care you might need, you're allowed to simply receive it fully, without needing to keep working through it first. There is something else worth resting on for a moment before we let it all go completely. Despite everything, the cold, the labor, the long invisible hours, there were still ordinary moments of quiet human connection tucked inside these difficult days. A shared joke between two kitchen servants while scrubbing pots side by side. A moment of rest, stolen briefly in a sunlit corner between tasks. A quiet friendship formed over years of shared work. Two people who understood exactly what the other's day had demanded, without needing to explain it at all. These small, human moments rarely made it into any historical record, yet they surely happened again and again in kitchens and stables and laundry yards across the whole country. It's worth remembering gently that even lives shaped mostly by hardship still held real warmth inside them, small, human, easily overlooked, and entirely real. That is nearly everything this particular story has to offer tonight. You don't need to hold onto any of these small details now. The fires, the water, the cold mornings, the careful hands. You can let all of this soften into a general impression, warm and dim at the edges, like a room remembered rather than a room you're standing in. There's no need to hold it tightly. Let it drift. Let your body settle again, even further than before. Let your breathing slow, gentle, and unhurried, each exhale a little longer than the one before it. Let the whole day, all of it, whatever it held, begin loosening its grip on you now, finger by finger, until it simply falls away. Somewhere, right now, the world keeps turning quietly on, steady and unbothered, exactly as it has for longer than any house, any hierarchy, any hardship ever lasted. The stars are still there above you, patient and unchanging, and they will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, long after every worry you carried tonight has quietly dissolved into something you barely remember. You don't have to do anything else right now. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.